Good evening, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Radow. Welcome, everybody at home. I'm the president of the Larchmont Mamaroneck League of Women Voters, and we're pleased to have with us tonight Tom Andersen, the New York Program and Communications Coordinator for Save the Sound. Tonight, Tom will tell us about the current state of the Long Island Sound, our multi-billion-dollar treasure located just about 1,000 feet from this room. The Long Island Sound is our region's most important environmental resource. It is also a great source of revenue for tourism, recreation, and sources of food. After a number of years of improved water quality, this past summer, the Western Sound suffered some of the lowest levels of dissolved oxygen recorded in 25 years. Tonight in Tom's talk titled, "The Long Island Sound Cleanup, Where Are We? What is to be Done?" you will learn about the probable cause of our current challenges and why colder temperatures this winter give some reason for optimism. Tom will discuss what is being done to solve the Sound's water quality problems and why we as individuals and as a community planning for the future's best interests of our community must remain vigilant to avoid the risks of returning to the disturbing water quality conditions that existed several decades ago. Save the Sound is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to protect and preserve the Long Island Sound. Save the Sound uses legal expertise, grassroots advocacy, volunteer work, and habitat restoration to preserve great coastal and inland sites, fight for clean water, restore rivers and marshes, and clean up hundreds of miles of coastline to preserve and protect the Sound now and for future generations. Tom Andersen is the author of This Fine Piece of Water, an environmental history of Long Island Sound published by Yale University Press. Tom's presentation will be followed by your questions and a discussion with audience members. But before Tom speaks, I'm pleased to introduce Town Supervisor Nancy Seligson, who's a longtime advocate for the Long Island Sound. Nancy's going to say a few words this evening. Nancy has been a leader in the Long Island Sound environmental advocacy for over 20 years. Nancy is currently the New York co-chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee of the Long Island Sound Study and the elected supervisor of the town of Mamaroneck. She started working with Save the Sound in 1991 as a volunteer and went on to hold positions as board chair and president of Save the Sound. Nancy chaired the Westchester County Committee on Non-Point Source Pollution of the Long Island Sound and the County Environmental Management Council. Nancy is the past president of the Westchester County Board of Health. She was also chair of the Westchester chapter of the League of Conservation Voters, as well as the Larchmont Mamaroneck Coastal Zone Management Commission. Please join me in welcoming Town Supervisor Nancy Seligson. Hi, Nancy.
Thank you, Beth. Good evening, everyone. I really want to thank Beth and Tom for letting me say a few words tonight. And I really wanted to because I am such a devotee of Long Island Sound. And of course, I live here in the town of Mamaroneck, specifically in Larchmont. But I've been really involved with Save the Sound for so long that I also wanted to vouch for them before they got up and spoke so that you could know how great they are. But I'm hoping that most of you already know that. In the audience tonight, we also have Evan Heller, who was the co-chair with me of the board of Save the Sound when we made a dramatic move in moving Save the Sound to be housed with Connecticut Fund for the Environment. And that has been a wonderful marriage for Save the Sound, and I think for CFE as well. You know, Larchmont and Mamaroneck has had a really, really intimate relationship with Long Island Sound, which is, of course, obvious. But first of all, from a sustenance and food standpoint, I mean, we know that there were oysters the size of dinner plates in Long Island Sound hundreds of years ago. We haven't seen them lately. We have a very vibrant yachting community. We have a big maritime economy. And of course, the whole real estate market is, I think, based a lot on being on Long Island Sound. So economically, it's very important, not just to the whole region, and it's been estimated at billions and billions of dollars to the region, but into our very little regional area here in Larchmont and Mamaroneck. I wanted to let you know that in 1992, I started a water quality monitoring program in Mamaroneck Harbor with Save the Sound. They were already monitoring water quality in Stamford Harbor, and I said, well, we have to do it in Mamaroneck also. It's a very important harbor. So we started monitoring water in Mamaroneck Harbor and Rye Harbor. And it was really wonderful because we got volunteers to work to go out early in the morning and measure the salinity, temperature, pH, and oxygen of the water. And that oxygen is so important for all living creatures. And Tom's going to talk about the changes that have happened over time. But in the late 80s, things were very, very terrible on Long Island Sound, and they started to really get better. And in our community, we could see it too. And we thought it would be very helpful to have that information for the immediate communities, for the village of Mamaroneck, town of Mamaroneck, and village of Larchmont. Save the Sound also was instrumental in creating something called the Clean Water Jobs Coalition, which brought together labor unions and labor leaders with the Business Industry Council and environmentalists to work together. And for the past 20 years, we've been going down to Washington together once a year to advocate for increased funding for Long Island Sound. Long Island Sound is woefully underfunded compared to all the other geographic programs in the country. We also helped create the Long Island Sound Watershed Alliance, which is a coalition of organizations all around the Sound who have an interest in Long Island Sound that share information, share education, share outreach, and really work together. The Long Island Sound Study Citizens Advisory Committee that I get to co-chair is kind of a mini alliance of those organizations around the Sound. And we work closely with the federal EPA and the state environmental agencies. In New York, it's the Department of Environmental Conservation. Again, really advocating for Long Island Sound and reminding those folks who work in all the bureaucratic agencies that are charged with regulating Long Island Sound and working for it, restoring it, that the citizens have a really strong interest in it. And finally, I just want to say that Save the Sound has been the most focused organization on Long Island Sound in our whole region, and historically has had wonderful, wonderful programs, board members, staff people, and has done some really important work on Long Island Sound. They have been a little quiet about it recently, and so I'm very happy that they're here tonight to be a little louder about it in our region and to tell us some of the work they want to do here in the Western Sound, because they really are the most experienced and expert group of folks working on the Sound. So thank you so much for letting me say a few words, and I'm really excited for folks around here to learn more about the Sound and to encourage everyone to volunteer to help Long Island Sound, which is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Nice to be here. As Beth and Nancy said, my name is Tom Andersen. My title is Program and Communications Coordinator for Save the Sound. Nancy just gave a terrific outline of what Save the Sound does. Advocacy, which she mentioned. One of the things she didn't mention that Save the Sound has really excelled at, mainly in Connecticut, but also on Long Island, is habitat restoration work. Legal work. Save the Sound has some terrific lawyers on staff, and if you pollute the Sound or if you violate your permit, they'll sue you. That's pretty much guaranteed. And they do a lot of education, including a specific education outreach program that we're starting this summer in Westchester County. My colleague Cameron Oakey is here, and I'm going to give him, I'm going to ask him to come up for about just a minute or two to talk about what he's going to be doing this summer. If you don't mind, Cam. Thanks.
I'm going to be very brief. I don't want to hold up the show. But I am this summer's Save the Sound's, a little redundant, summer outreach coordinator. I'm spearheading, it's a new program for Save the Sound, working at yacht, beach clubs, and other organizations in Western Long Island Sound. The major thrust of it is educating junior sailors and youth about the sound, and also reaching families and adults. Some of the stuff we'll be doing is youth education, all very hands-on, and water quality monitoring engagements, as Nancy mentioned. We'll be doing some of those as well and looking for volunteers, as well as public presentations such as this one throughout the summer. So we're looking to build awareness and advocacy, and if you're interested in any of that, please chat with me after the presentation, and my information's over there, and thank you again.
Thanks, Ken. So ages ago, I worked down this area as a newspaper reporter. It was so long ago, actually, that there was a newspaper right here in Mamaroneck. It was on Library Lane, the Mamaroneck Daily Times. Then in the summer of 1987, I was at the New Rochelle Standard Star, which is where we were transferred to. And one evening in July, third week of July 1987, I was in the newsroom of the Standard Star, 92 North Avenue, and the phone on my desk rang. I answered it, and the guy on the other end said he had just come back from fishing off the seawall at Hudson Park in New Rochelle. He said it was just starting to get dark, and as he was fishing, he heard a noise below him, and he looked down on the rocks, and lobsters were actually climbing out of the water onto the rocks. He said not only that, but the beach at Hudson Park, right next to where he was fishing, bluefish were swimming in the shallows. And the bluefish were so listless and docile that people were able to wade into the water, catch the bluefish with their hands, bring them home, presumably to eat. The next day, I was back in the newsroom, and I knew that I needed to look a little bit further into this, so I made some calls, and one of the first people I called was the harbor master here in Mamaroneck, Jim Mancusi. Is he still the harbor master? No. Okay. So Jim used to be the harbor master. Jim told me there are so many dead fish in Mamaroneck Harbor that we're scooping them up with snow shovels and putting them in garbage bags. I got in my car and I drove up to Portchester, where I knew some lobstermen, and I ran into a lobsterman named John Fernandez. John, how are the lobsters doing? The lobsters are all dead, he told me. By coincidence, that very same week, a researcher, a scientist at the University of Connecticut named Barbara Welsh was out in a boat on this part of the Sound taking water quality measurements. And Barbara, she was an experienced researcher. Before UConn, she had been at Yale. She had done work on Chesapeake Bay and Mobile Bay. Barbara told me that those days, that week on Long Island Sound, she saw something that she had never seen before. That was dissolved oxygen levels at zero. She'd never seen it at Chesapeake Bay. She'd never seen it at Mobile Bay. She said that she was so surprised by what she saw that she had her crew check the instruments because she assumed they were wrong. She said as they were out there, they smelled, they saw fish breaching the surface, fish coming up to the surface, and what she assumed was a desperate attempt to find air, to get oxygen, because there was none in the water. She smelled a stench like rotten eggs coming out of the surface of the water. And what it turned out to be was, when dissolved oxygen in the bottom sediments reached zero, it triggered a chemical reaction that released hydrogen sulfide from the sediments, and hydrogen sulfide is a toxin. Any animals that were still alive that managed to survive the zero levels of dissolved oxygen were killed by the hydrogen sulfide. She sent her divers, some of the guys on her crew were divers, she sent them down to take a look at what was going on. And she told me they came up after about 10 minutes. And what they reported was that the water was so thick with the decaying flesh of dead fish that they couldn't see. Not only that, but it was clogging the breathing apparatus of their scuba gear. I made a call up to Norwalk. A lot of you may be familiar with the Hudson Riverkeeper organization. Hudson Riverkeeper decided that they wanted to expand to Long Island Sound. They had some money. They wanted to hire a Long Island Sound keeper. The Riverkeeper had been doing a good job. And they hired a fellow named Terry Backer as Long Island Sound keeper. Terry's still the sound keeper, in fact. I asked Terry if I could come up to Norwalk, talk to him about what he was going to do, and talk to him about what was going on in the Sound. And Terry put me in a little boat. He and I went up in a little outboard on the Norwalk River right near where the Maritime Aquarium is now. We went under the drawbridge, under the railroad bridge, and very quickly we approached a complex of buildings on the east bank. And as we approached, the water in the Norwalk River was black. It was opaque. If I had had the nerve to put my fingers in, I would not have been able to see them more than 2 or 3 inches below the surface. And not only was the water black, but the surface was covered with tiny white flecks, tiny white things. And I said to Terry, what's going on here? Why is this water black and what's all this white stuff? Terry said those buildings, that's the Norwalk sewage treatment plant. And the white stuff on the water is cellulose. It is essentially the remains of toilet paper. The Norwalk sewage treatment plant was in such bad shape that it was releasing toilet paper into the Norwalk River. And not just the Norwalk River, but it would flow down the river, Norwalk Harbor, and into Long Island Sound. And it wasn't just the Norwalk sewage treatment plant. Treatment plants all over Long Island Sound were emptying 1 billion gallons every day of inadequately treated sewage. And the result was that year after year, dissolved oxygen concentrations in this part of the Sound mainly, but not exclusively, were falling to levels that were dangerous for marine life, and in 1987 they fell to 0. And in the 3rd week of July, that led to fish and lobster kills pretty much in every harbor from City Island on the west as far east as Bridgeport in Connecticut. Some examples: July 27, 1987, Hempstead Harbor and Manhasset Bay, lobsters, fluke, window pane flounder, blackfish, pipefish, rock crabs, horseshoe crabs, lady crabs, moss bunkers, eels, and killifish, all dead. July 29th, Manhasset Bay, winter flounder, window pane flounder, and rock crabs, all dead. Off Sands Point, more than 500 pounds of lobsters died in traps. July 31st, off City Island, dead moss bunkers, rock crabs, winter flounder. Dead crabs and lobsters were pulled in traps from 70 feet of water off Northport. August 3rd, in Hempstead Harbor, hog chokers, winter flounder, fluke, eels, crabs. August 7th, Lloyd Point, dead lobsters. August 17th, in Norwalk Harbor, where Terry Backer and I had been, an estimated 1 million fish died in Norwalk Harbor alone. So I like to ask the rhetorical question of why is this important? It's obvious why it's important, but there are some specific reasons why it's important. In 1990 and 1991, the EPA asked an economist at the University of Connecticut to do a study of the economic value of Long Island Sound. And she determined that the businesses that rely on the Sound to be clean, the beach clubs, the yacht clubs, fishing business, lobstering, oystering, etc., those businesses contribute to the economy of New York and coastal Connecticut $5.5 billion a year. So in 1991 dollars, Long Island Sound was a $5.5 billion economic resource. And it's also important because Long Island Sound is an estuary, and estuaries are among the most biologically productive ecosystems on the planet. Estuary is a place, it's an arm of the sea where salt water from the sea meets and mingles with fresh water running down streams. They're very productive. Estuaries produce more biological material than temperate forests and than grasslands. They produce more biological material per acre than the tundra. Modern, heavily fertilized farms produce only half as much biological material per acre as estuaries and coastal waters. And in fact, only tropical rainforests and coral reefs produce more than estuaries and coastal waters. So they're incredibly rich ecologically. Long Island Sound is incredibly important economically, and it is into this important resource that we decided 200 years ago that we were going to dump our waste. First our industrial waste, mainly in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, and then throughout the 20th century as the suburbs grew and the cities in Long Island Sound grew, our household waste to the tune now of, as I said, about 1 billion gallons a day. Now, coincidentally, in the mid-1980s was the start of a long-term study of Long Island Sound by EPA in the states of New York and Connecticut. They wanted to determine what was wrong with the sound, what the cause was, and what could be done to fix it. And they determined that sewage treatment plants They determined that the key to Long Island Sound was nitrogen in the sewage treatment plants. Nitrogen, a component of treated sewage, was getting into the sound, and nitrogen is a nutrient. It acted as a fertilizer in the sound, fertilizing algae. When the algae died and decomposed, the decomposition process would remove oxygen from the water. And this, as I mentioned, this would happen pretty much every summer. It's a warm water phenomenon. And so after many years, what seemed like many years at the time of debate and discussion and computer modeling, they decided that sewage treatment plants along the Sound, to end this hypoxia crisis, would have to upgrade to remove nitrogen, and they would have to remove 58.5% of the nitrogen that enters their plants with a deadline of 2014. And then actually they extended that deadline to 2017 for New York City and for Westchester County. So 2014, 58.5% deadline. We're obviously getting close to 2014, so the question is, how are we doing? And the answer is, in terms of nitrogen removal, not all that bad. We're 80% of the way towards that 58.5% goal. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by Connecticut and New York to do nitrogen removal programs. You've probably seen the work that's being done here in Mamaroneck. Same thing with the New Rochelle sewage treatment plant. 80% of the way towards the goal, but not without a couple of roadblocks. In about 10 years ago, the state of Connecticut, which funds its sewage treatment plant upgrades through what they call the Clean Water Fund in Hartford. The Clean Water Fund supplies money to sewage treatment plant operators in the form of low-interest loans and grants. The state of Connecticut, for a number of years in the early 2000s, started taking money out of the Clean Water Fund and using it for projects other than clean water. Road building, for example. We're fine for now, I'll let you know. Road building, for example. Save the Sound was one of the organizations that discovered this, and over a number of years of fairly intense lobbying, got the state of Connecticut to not only start fully funding the Clean Water Fund again, but also start using the money for what it was supposed to be used for, fixing sewage treatment plants. The result was, though, that Connecticut fell behind for a number of years, only to catch up later. In New York, there's been a number of roadblocks as well, one of the most important being what's been happening in Great Neck. Save the Sound is in court challenging a New York State consent order that allows the Great Neck sewage treatment plant to dump more nitrogen into the Sound than is allowed by its permit. Let me give you some numbers. According to its permit, Great Neck is allowed to dump 238 pounds of nitrogen per day into Long Island Sound. But in fact, over the past 18 months or so, it's been dumping 526 pounds a day, so almost twice as much as it was allowed. The state, inexplicably, signed a consent order with Great Neck, allowing it to actually increase above that. The consent order says they can dump 635 pounds. So they're only allowed 238 pounds. They were dumping 526 pounds, and the state basically said, sure, that's fine, dump more. You can go to 653 pounds. Save the Sound went to court to get that consent order overturned, to get them back on their permit limits. That court case is pending now. It's still in the courts. Save the Sound's appeal argues that the consent order violates Federal Clean Water Act prohibitions against exactly this kind of backsliding. The appeal contends that the order allows more nitrogen than is permitted by state and federal pollution limits for the Sound, and it also argues that DEC entered into the consent order without the required public notice and public hearing. So it's 2012, we're 80% of the way there in terms of nitrogen removal. One logical question is, have we seen an 80% improvement in water quality? And this is where I want to look at a couple of other slides. Can you show the slide of the different colors on the map, please, Cam? No. Yes, this one. And maybe we should dim the lights. Can you see that, or should we dim the lights? A little bit lower, okay.
No, the other thing, the bottom one.
That's better. I still, not, a little bit, please, a little higher, because I still need to see. I think that's okay. Thanks, Ken. So, since early 90s, 1991, as part of the Long Island Sound Study, the state of Connecticut has been taking water quality measurements year-round, particularly in summer, and making maps based on those water quality measurements. And what this map shows is the extent of hypoxia first week of August 1994. And so what this shows is the area of green, the area of blue is where water quality is excellent, mainly out obviously in the far eastern sound. Green is where it's okay. When it starts to get to be yellow and orange and red, not quite as good. The red indicates areas where dissolved oxygen concentrations are below 2 milligrams per liter, but higher than 1. And the black shows dissolved oxygen concentrations that are below 1 and almost 0. And just for context, in a normally healthy estuary, dissolved oxygen concentration should be about 8 milligrams per liter. So when you get down to 2, 3, and 2 and 1, that's obviously a big percentage decrease. So this shows 1994. Next map, please, Karen. This is 2008, mid-August 2008. You can see it's a little bit different, but there's still a big section of red and black off Fairfield and Westchester and Nassau counties.
That includes where we are, right?
Absolutely includes where we are, yeah. Mamaroneck, this is Portchester, Rye, Mamaroneck, Larchmont, and Rochelle. That summer, obviously for some period of days in August, there was basically no dissolved oxygen off Westchester and Nassau, and no marine life either.
Just to clear, as you head in towards the city, it's blue again. What's happening?
That's
there?
because they stopped testing at the city line.
Good. That would likely be the dark color.
That would probably be pretty bad as well, yeah, sure. So what's on the next slide, Ken, if you don't mind?
2010.
Okay, show me that one then. 2010, you can see, not bad at all. Middle of August 2010, almost all green. And 2007, 2009, 2010, 2011, there was none of the sound had any of that black area, and only a little bit had red area. So it looked like there was some real improvement happening. 2010 being probably one of the best year. And let me also take a step back to explain to you in terms of fish habitat, what these different colors mean. Do me a favor and go backwards one. So remember I mentioned that the Connecticut DEP has been doing these water quality measurements for years and years. When they do the water quality measurements, they also trawl for fish, and they count all the fish, they count the species, they measure the fish, and they weigh the fish. And the weight of the fish is called the biomass. And then they've correlated those numbers to the dissolved oxygen concentrations. And what they've learned is that when dissolved oxygen falls below 4, which is basically the orange area, anything below 4, the total biomass of fish, the total weight of all the fish they catch, declines by 4%. When it falls below 3, which is the orange, the total biomass falls below 41%. So in other words, the impacts on fish are starting to be noticeable. When it falls below 2, which is the red, total biomass falls by 82%. So that means basically in terms of biomass, obviously 80% of the fish are gone. And when it falls below 1, which is the black, it's 0. There's no fish at all. Total biomass is reduced to 0. So let's go to the map for 2012, if you don't mind. I think it's 2 more. This is what we reverted to in 2012. August, in water quality sampling done August 14th through 16th. You can see there's a big area of black and red off Westchester and Nassau. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit to give you an idea of just how bad it was. 2012, hypoxia was widespread and it was intense. More than 20% of the Sound's 1,320 square miles were hit by low dissolved oxygen, And as you can see, much of the sound off Westchester and Nassau counties had virtually no dissolved oxygen at all in mid-August. 288.5 square miles of Long Island Sound had dissolved oxygen concentrations below 3. That's everything that's orange, red, and black combined. And that made 2012 the 4th worst year since records started being kept in 1991. And some parts of the Sound had dissolved oxygen concentrations that low for 63 days. So it wasn't just intense, it was long. And one of the really interesting things to me was that the dissolved oxygen below 3, usually we think of hypoxia as being a Western Sound phenomenon. It's Westchester County, it's Nassau County, it's parts of Fairfield. But it went all the way out here. This is Branford, Connecticut. And way out here, Smithtown Bay. So hypoxia in 2012 was not just a Western Sound phenomenon, it was a Central Sound phenomenon as well. In fact, it was only the 3rd time since 1991 that the area off Branford out here saw dissolved oxygen concentrations below 3 milligrams per liter. The area of red covered 67 square miles, that's below 2 milligrams per liter. And the area shown in black covered 18 square miles, and that's basically everything off Larchmont, New Rochelle, over to Sands Point on Long Island. And the 18 square miles was the 7th worst year. That situation is called not hypoxia, but anoxia, the absence of oxygen. The 7th worst year for anoxia since 1991. So the question is why, if we've gotten 80% of the way there, why was 2012 so bad? A couple of reasons. A scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who is he's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's liaison to the EPA's Long Island Sound office. He wrote this about a month or so ago, maybe a month and a half. The first part is a paraphrase. He wrote on the Long Island Sound Studies website, there are so many variables. Let me take another step back. Somebody asked him a specific question. When can we expect to see water quality improve? There are so many variables that affect the severity of hypoxia year to year, and so many sources of nitrogen besides sewage plants, that there is bound to be a lag between reaching the nitrogen reduction goal and seeing water quality improvements. And here are 2 key paragraphs that I'm going to quote directly from him. Quote, many studies from European estuaries, which are way ahead of us on this front, have shown that the ecosystem has a 5 to 10 year lag between when the loadings were reduced, that is when the nitrogen was reduced, and when the primary productivity stopped. Primary productivity being the fertilization of the algae by the nitrogen. So a 5 to 10 year lag between when the nitrogen is removed and when the primary productivity stops. One hypothesis for this is that the sediments have so much nitrogen stored up in them that after the reduction, they release nitrogen back into the water for several years, which masks the impact of the reduction. In summary, he wrote, even if the reductions to this point were working perfectly, the year-to-year variability makes it unlikely that we would be able to detect an immediate reduction in hypoxia associated with a sewage loading reduction of this magnitude if it were occurring, which it may be. And even if it isn't occurring yet, it doesn't mean that these management efforts have failed, because it's very possible, even likely, that we'll experience a similar lag in response time of several years. So patience is the watchword. And then there's another, you mentioned a lot of variables. One of the key variables is temperature, in the short term temperature, and the long term climate change. Among the many things that the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection tests for when it does all these water quality testing that I've mentioned is temperature. The DEEP, It used to be the DEP, now it's the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, which I'll henceforth just call the department. The department records water temperature throughout the sound roughly twice a month. For the 10 months from January through October 2012, they took measurements on 16 occasions. So they didn't get out every month, they got out eight of those 10 months. And here's the way they do it. They drop a probe through the water column that takes the temperature readings, and it takes them consistently. So it goes from the top to the bottom, taking temperature readings all throughout the entire way and recording them automatically. And it does this in, I don't know, maybe 80 different locations. It's not just a couple, it's a lot. It's probably not 80, but it's a lot. And then they keep track of the highest and the lowest temperatures each month, and the average. As I said, they've been doing this since 1991. As a result, they were able to compare temperatures from each research trip in 2012 through October with temperatures from the corresponding months during each of the previous 21 years. On 9 of the 16 research trips in 2012, the maximum recorded temperature was the highest in 21 years. And those highest temperatures included January, February, and March, when the sound is typically coldest. Not only that, but the minimum recorded temperature was the highest in 21 years on 15 occasions, including January, February, March, and April. The average temperature on those 16 research trips in 2012 was the highest in 21 years on 11 occasions. In other words, Long Island Sound was unusually warm in 2012, and it did not cool off as much as it typically has in the past. This is a problem because warm water holds less dissolved oxygen naturally than cooler water. Warm water is also more conducive to the growth of algae. And what plants grow when it's warmer, obviously. And the algae, as I mentioned, feed on the nitrogen and remove oxygen when they die and decompose. The researcher at the state of Connecticut who told me this wrote me this in an email back in December. He said, one peculiar observation that we made that may have had an impact on the hypoxic event this year was a persistent sound-wide algal bloom. We first noted the abundant bloom in April, and it was observed sound-wide during each survey since, even during our December survey. So algae was blooming in the sound from April through December, unlike normal years when it's typically June until the temperatures start to cool off in September and October. Another big change in the sound, and then I'm going to wrap up, talk a little bit about what might possibly be done. Because of the water temperature change, the Long Island Sound ecosystem has changed. Long Island Sound used to be a place where predominantly cold water fish lived. Since 1997, it has been a place where predominantly warm water fish live. We've changed the entire ecosystem through warmer water temperatures. And one of the species that has been the hardest hit is lobsters. As you've probably heard, lobster fishing, the lobster industry in Long Island Sound has been decimated. Lobster are a cold water species, and they hardly even survive in Long Island Sound anymore. So what can we as individuals do? Well, a couple of things. If you have lawns, stop using chemical fertilizers because they very quickly get into the waterways and contribute to the over-enrichment of Long Island Sound. We heard an interesting thing. When Save the Sound a year and a half ago was looking into whether it wanted to do more work in Westchester County, we held sort of a focus group in Rye. And we invited a number of people, including a number of local politicians. And one of the people who came was George Latimer, who at the time was your assemblyman. Now I think he's your state senator. And George said an interesting thing at this meeting. He said, you know, when I first started, he started as a councilman in Rye, and then county board, and then assemblyman. George said, I used to hear about Long Island Sound from my constituents all the time. He said, it's been years since anybody said to me that Long Island Sound is important. So one of the really important things you could do is let your elected officials, from Mayor Rosenblum, you don't have to tell Nancy Seligman because she knows, but Mayor Rosenblum here in Mamaroneck, Assemblyman Steve Otis, Senator Latimer, County Legislator Judy Myers, that Long Island Sound is an important issue. And I think they would appreciate hearing that, because that gives them the backbone to vote for the right legislation and to vote for the right funding appropriations for Long Island Sound. Another thing that needs to be done on Long Island Sound, and I have a feeling I'm probably preaching to the converted here, it's a small crowd, but you know, we're in this period now when taxes are seen by and large as a bad thing. But when you pay your sewer taxes, you're paying essentially for something that is going directly to clean up Long Island Sound. Your sewer taxes, if you live in Mamaroneck or in Larchmont or in Rye or in New Rochelle, are going towards upgrading these sewage plants to do nitrogen removal. And so letting your elected officials know, maybe you don't have to let them know that you like your taxes, but maybe you just don't need to tell them that you don't like your taxes for this case, because supporting the tax increases to pay for the sound cleanup is an important thing to do. And I guess the final thing is support organizations like Save the Sound. If you're not a member, become a member. And that would let Save the Sound know that working in this area is important. And that reminds me, I'll take questions, by the way, but we have a sign-up sheet. And if you don't mind, if you could just write down your name and address, and particularly your email. I'm sorry we have yours, but we would like to, you are? Okay, we'd like to include you on our email list and on our mailing list. So that wraps it up for me. I'm happy to take questions, and if you have questions for Cam, by all means. Sir?
Tom, I mean, this is also referred to as M4, right, this whole issue? I don't know if you...
You're talking about, you're talking about the
Clean
new
Water
stormwater
Act,
regulations.
Right. So,
Right.
I mean, I don't want to conflate the issues, but can you offer a range of cost estimates as to what will get us to, 100% or 105% of where we need to be over whatever the 10 to 15 year horizon that we'll say we've solved it?
I can tell you roughly what the costs are for upgrading the Mamaroneck and the New Rochelle sewage treatment plants. It's about $400 million. And that will get us to the 58.5% goal. Another issue, particularly in Mamaroneck, but also Larchmont, Harrison, Rye, is that not just the sewage treatment plants, but the sewers themselves are in incredibly bad shape. The sewers are so bad that they essentially all the time leak sewage into local waterways. And when it rains, it's even worse, because the rainwater forces the sewage out and the clean water gets into the sewers. And so while Westchester County is confident that over the short term it can reach its 58.5% goal, it's worried that over the longer term, all this excess water getting into the sewage plant, it's going to increase the amount of nitrogen and make it much tougher to reach the 58.5% goal. So the county is about to start working with the municipalities, and I use working with in quotes, I think it's going to enforce the law, to get them to start to fix these sewers. Mamaroneck Village, Rich Slingerland, the village manager, told us about 2 months ago that the village had just approved some bonding to start doing this work, and has actually already fixed about, I believe he said 25,000 linear feet of sewers in Mamaroneck to try to end this problem. What the cost of that's going to be, I don't know. It's a major problem, and it's a long-term problem.
It's my understanding that the local municipalities are kind of on their own as far as enforcement. The county can take a leadership role, but I'm not sure that they're in a position to forcing municipalities to do.
Here's what the county did. The county is under consent order by the state to fix the sewage treatment plants. The county commissioned a study of the sewers themselves, town by town, municipality by municipality, and now has a record of which municipalities contribute the most to the inflow and infiltration problem. And on a scale, Mamaroneck Village is the worst. Probably, my recollection is Rye and Mamaroneck Town are probably the best. All the others are in between. The county has submitted that report to the state, and has asked the state to make that report part of the consent order. And if it becomes part of the consent order, the county will then be obligated to meet those sewer improvement goals, and will then have the legal backup to enforce, to basically to force the municipalities to do the work. I think it doesn't want to have to force them to, it wants them to do it cooperatively. And as I mentioned, Mamaroneck Village, to its credit, has started on it.
The sewage treatment plant that's here in Mamaroneck is having a big addition, and I thought it said something about nitrogen.
That's what it's doing, absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
so they're in the process, the county is in the process.
Absolutely, yes, it's, as I said, it's, overall, I didn't mention Westchester County specifically, and I probably should have. Westchester County was given a 3-year extension. It doesn't need to meet the 58.5% goal for its sewage treatment plants in Portchester, Rye, Mamaroneck, and New Rochelle until 2017. But it's far enough ahead on the work that it's confident that it's going to meet the goal by the end of 2014. So it's actually done a good job. It's not there yet. We've got to watch them to make sure they don't backslide. But it seems as if they've done a pretty good job.
Can I ask a really stupid question? Biology 101. Like, when plants grow, isn't there photosynthesis and aren't they releasing oxygen?
Yeah.
So isn't
Yes.
it a good thing to have plants?
Well, that's interesting, and I don't know enough about it, but I do know that when
I'm just not.
no during the summer, one of the things they see during the times of bad hypoxia, specifically and especially near the surface, is an oversaturation of dissolved oxygen. They'll get dissolved oxygen concentrations near the surface of 12 and 13 and 14, where 8 would be healthy. And it's because of this, I forget the word that they use now, but it's because of this production because of photosynthesis is producing oxygen. But it's actually a bad sign because the other side of that is it reduces the oxygen in the deeper waters to near zero.
Well, I can try and answer it as well. So the plant, all the nutrients come in, the nitrogen, the algae go crazy, and I guess oxygen can spike like that. I didn't know. But if you spike the oxygen in the water, it's going to go up into the air because the air would have less than the water then, so it's going to want to balance out, just chemistry. And then when all the algae dies because it's burned up all the nitrogen, the amount of oxygen is used, the oxygen that's in the water is used to decompose, and that far outweighs the benefit. So decomposition really burns up oxygen. It happens in the soil too, but air
So
is
the
a lot
fish are
more.
happy for a little while, and then they're not happy? Is that what it is?
And then and water that has
Then if you see flying fish, you understand why.
yeah, and water that has lost where algae has died and the oxygen is burned up can be very, very clear. Like you can see down 20 feet because all the algae, everything has died down and then decomposed and used up all the oxygen.
So clear water's not a good one.
It depends. It can.
Typically in summer, the hypoxia problem is in the deeper waters. One of the reasons 1987 was such a problem, and 1989 was bad too, was that the surface waters and the harbors also had zero dissolved oxygen. So everything was sort of linked up, and there were no refuges for the fish to go.
Couple of things. You mentioned before fertilizer. Can you clarify for people, are you talking about fertilizer that has nitrogen in it? And it is, so if we were to want to fertilize our lawn, there might be other options that we would have. Is that really the main culprit that we need to be paying attention to?
Chemical nitrogen fertilizers are absolutely the worst, yes. If you can use organic fertilizers, or if you can manage to survive without fertilizing your lawn, that's probably the best. But yeah, chemical nitrogen fertilizers are the worst. I don't pretend in any way to be an expert about this. I've simply read about it. What I've read is that chemical nitrogen fertilizers can much more readily be washed off the lawn than organic fertilizers. And so if you put them on and there's a rainstorm, they're gone, right into the waterways.
So if we clean up the nitrogen, but we still are dealing with warmer temperatures because we have other things going on with global warming, What can we expect even if we meet our percentage?
I don't know.
Is
If
that not?
We may, I assume that they've done some computer modeling on that, but I don't know what the results would be. At best, it's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. At worst, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. If water temperature keeps increasing, and hypoxia is a warm water phenomenon, who knows what would happen? Ma'am?
Just linked to that remark, one of the problems is that it's very hard to find lawn care people who will apply organic fertilizer. In fact, I haven't found one. There's one guy, but he charges like $3,000 a year just for the fertilizer. It's a little high. And the other guys, I've been fighting with my guy. I love him, but he will not apply any of the commonly available organic compounds that you can buy at Tony's Nursery. It's really a problem.
Yeah.
Unless you stop fertilizing altogether, and your gardener won't do that either. So, because they don't want
Are
their
there not local
job
laws
to-
though? I thought that there had been laws that had been
For-
passed, is that?
For phosphorus, not for nitrogen.
Oh, that's right.
But it's also public spaces, it's not.
Is that right?
It's not private, okay.
Yeah. Phosphorus is more of a problem in lakes and reservoirs, in freshwater, nitrogen more in saltwater.
Is the EPA putting any pressure on the communities that face Long Island Sound, or have they given up?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They've not given up at all. EPA has done a good job at this. The specific regulatory responsibility is the state. So EPA, all of this is based on the Federal Clean Water Act.
Yeah.
EPA essentially tells the states, you need to enforce the Clean Water Act, and the states tell the local governments, in this case Westchester County, which runs the treatment plants, you need to upgrade the sewage treatment plants. And the Westchester County tells the taxpayers, you need to pay more tax money for us to upgrade the sewage treatment plants. In Connecticut, they do it a little differently. They give low-cost loans and grants. New York State doesn't do much of that anymore. The feds used to do it until the Reagan era. Reagan stopped that. It used to be that when Mamaroneck upgraded its sewage treatment plant in the 1980s, it got 75% of the money 55% from the feds and another 25 or 20% from the state. So it got 75% of the upgrade costs from the state or federal government. But that ended with Reagan.
Another question is, how come Lake Neck got away with getting an exemption?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why Save the Sound went to court, because
I mean, it sounds
Well,
absolutely.
why do they have do we know why they have so much nitrogen?
large sizes.
I didn't really give you any context. I don't know if that's so much compared to everybody else. I mean,
Oh,
it's
okay.
I don't know the
Do
size of
they
that
have
treatment
leaders
plant.
in Albany that we don't? Is that possible, or?
It might.
In general,
I can only speculate. I don't know. I don't know.
Now, it's interesting because in Connecticut, I had a home right off the Connecticut River for 18 years in Old Saybrook. I had septic. We didn't have sewage treatment. It was all in our backyard, and the law required us to clean our septic every 2 years.
Right.
And that was actually enforced. But it's only in Upper Westchester, as far as I know, that we've got septic. We really do mostly have waste treatment down here.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So what are some of the fish that have come new, and what are some of the things that are gone? I still see some mussels and
Yeah.
oysters.
From somebody told me, I think it was Sarah actually told me that mussels. There seem to be more of them now in this area, Milton Harbor and Mamaroneck Harbor and oyster reefs. It's not that the fish have disappeared, it's just that there are a lot fewer of them. I'll give you, let's see if I can find my notes here. Winter flounder is a big one. Winter flounder used to be the most popular sport fish in the Sound. Now it's not, it's a very low abundance. And as of a number of years ago, I haven't heard this lately, but as of a number of years ago, they were no longer even spawning successfully. They would spawn, but then they'd die after about 2 years. Winter flounder is a cold water fish. Summer flounder, the name would indicate that it's a warm water fish, and that's more abundant. Scup and butterfish Save the Sound, Connecticut Fund for the Environment, has an excellent blog. It's called Green Cities, Blue Waters. And you can find it by going to the website is ctenvironment.org, and you can see the blog. One of the things I do is write for that blog. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from something I wrote back in the fall about this change from cold water fish to warm water fish. The research crew counted and identified everything it caught. The two researchers, Penny Howell and Peter Oster, then categorized those fish by the temperature range they prefer. 33 of the species were adapted to cold water, 34 were adapted to warm water, and 28 were subtropical. The researchers then noted that starting in 1991, water temperature grew markedly warmer on average in March through June and August through October. As the temperature rose, the kinds of fish in the Sound changed. There were fewer fish that are adapted to cold water and more that are adapted to warm or subtropical water. Of the 18 species that are cold adapted, 12 declined in abundance and 4 increased. Of the 22 warm adapted species, 4 declined and 11 increased. Meanwhile, the total number of fish, regardless of species, hauled in each time the trawl was raised, decreased in spring when the water is cold and increased in fall when the water is still warm. This was particularly notable when the average temperature of the Sound rose above 42.8 degrees Fahrenheit in spring and above 67 degrees in fall. And a quote from the paper, this is a peer-reviewed paper that they published, a quote from that paper: "These temperatures were relatively rare before 1998, but much more common afterward," the authors wrote. Howell and Oster give a couple of examples of why fish are affected by the change in temperature. Scup, for one, increased in abundance from about 3 fish per tow from 1984 to 98 to about 19 per tow from 99 to 2008. Scup will avoid an area if the water temperature is below about 45 degrees and have a history of large die-offs when shallow water suddenly turns cold. They're finding the warmer Sound to be a welcoming habitat. Quote, "This species is no longer excluded from the area due to unfavorable temperatures," they wrote. Fish reproduction is also affected. Butterfish don't spawn very much when the water temperature is below 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Windowpane flounder don't spawn at all in water that is above 59 degrees Fahrenheit. In the Sound, the average number of butterfish caught in each trawl almost doubled over time. The average number of windowpane flounder caught in each trawl dropped from 53 to 8. So the cold water species are going, the warm water species are moving in. Interestingly, Howell and Oster, I don't have this quote right here, but they said that they wanted to make it clear that in terms of fish abundance and diversity and biological richness, there's no difference between the warm water species and the cold water species. It's just that the warm are replacing the cold. And by the way, last year was an incredible year for blue claw crabs in the Sound. I mean, in Connecticut in particular, millions and millions and millions of them. And of course, that's like a typical Barnegat Bay or Chesapeake Bay species rather than Long Island Sound. So anyway, yeah.
I know out in Suffolk County, both on the Sound and in the Peconic Bay, that there's some efforts to reseed oyster beds. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the oyster population in Long Island Sound and what role oysters play?
The oyster population is generally okay. New York does not allow oystering at all in Westchester County, and I haven't asked them in recently, but a number of years ago they told me they're not likely to allow it at all because of the consistent and persistent bacterial problems in the waters here. But in Connecticut and in Oyster Bay on Long Island, the oyster industry is doing pretty well. I mean, it has its ups and downs. Every once in a while there are diseases that affect the oysters, and the last 2 years Irene and Sandy buried a lot of oyster beds. And I don't have the numbers in front of me or even in my head, but my recollection is that there are about 60 active oyster companies in Connecticut. And a lot of relatively new small ones who are raising oysters for what's come to be known as sort of the boutique oyster trade in New York City. You know, people who, restaurants, high-end restaurants that want good oysters that they can say are locally grown. And so that's starting to happen.
The cold water fish, when they don't, are they able to swim someplace else where it's a little
Well, they still
colder?
live up north where it's colder.
They do, okay.
Yeah, they're just not, it's just not their habitat here
It's
anymore.
important that they have someplace to go.
Well, yes, they're not becoming extinct. They're still Maine, for example.
So how, speaking of lobster then, how far do we have to go for the lobster to thrive? Is it Maine, or are they able to?
In Maine, they're still doing okay. In fact, they were so abundant in Maine that the lobstermen were complaining the supply and demand was off for them. The supply was way too high. The prices were going way down. Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
has to do, I think, has to do with cod. And the cod
Oh yeah,
aren't eating the lobsters. So
it's because they don't know cod.
there's no,
Yes.
the cods are.
Yes.
Right.
There's no more
So,
anything
so they,
except lobsters.
the lobsters are growing.
Yeah.
doing fine as well.
And in the deeper waters off New York, there are still lobsters because the water's still cold, but it's just in the Sound. And in the areas close to shore, Long Island Sound always was the furthest south that you could find lobsters. So this was the extent of the habitat range anyway, and just a small change in temperature made it no longer habitable. Anyone else? Yes, sure.
You mentioned earlier that, people ought to communicate with their representatives about legislation concerning the Sound. Is there anything in particular that's coming down the pipe that people should be making themselves heard about?
That is an excellent question that I can't answer, but you know what? I will find out and I will write about it on the blog, and if you're on our email list, I'll let you know. I think the short answer is no, but there may very well be some funding bills that would affect the Sound that, maybe they're not specific Long Island Sound bills, but indirectly, or directly, well, not by name, they would affect the Sound. And you should know about those. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Yes, sure.
Tom, thank you so much. I learned so much tonight, and thank you all for coming and for everybody at home. What we'll do is we'll follow up also. I know I spoke to Nancy Seligson before the event tonight. I think what we need to figure out when they're doing their lobbying in Washington is to find out what we may be able to do in terms of funding. If we've got a multi-billion-dollar asset here, we ought to be figuring out what we as the League of Women Voters can be doing to educate people, and where we might be targeting our elected officials in a letter writing campaign or what have you, to figure out where the funding needs to be. So thank you very much, and you'll be hearing from the League soon. We're going to be announcing our annual meeting, except we're waiting on the scheduling of our speaker. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all at home. Have a good night.